Hello, my name is Mary Kidd and I am Director of the Saltire Society. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the third of the Saltire Sessions, a new series of online conversations with the creators and thinkers shaping the cultural landscape of Scotland today. We hope these discussions will offer you food for thought, signpost you to new and thought-provoking books, events, and other cultural activity, or perhaps inspire you in your own creative pursuits. Each is designed to slot into a lunch break or similar time in your day. Today, it is my very great pleasure to be speaking with Zoe Venditozzi. Zoe is a writer and educator born in Lancashire and raised in North East Fife. She holds a master's in creative writing, and her debut novel, Anywhere's Better Than Here, was shortlisted for The Guardian's Not the Booker Prize in 2013. Zoe is very active in Scotland's literature landscape as a book festival speaker and interviewer and a creative writing tutor. Like many creatives, she combined her practice with a day job for many years, working as a support for learning teacher. In 2020, Zoe launched the Witches of Scotland campaign with Claire Mitchell KC, then of course Claire Mitchell QC, a Scottish advocate with particular specialism on constitutional issues, human rights and sentencing. Witches of Scotland seeks to raise awareness of the injustice of Scotland's witch hunting in the early modern period and to secure a pardon for those convicted to supplement the apology already secured for all those affected. Zoe and Claire have a podcast, appear at speaking events all across the globe, and have published How to Kill a Witch, a guide for the patriarchy, which combines non-fiction with fiction by Zoe. In February 2025, they officially registered the Witches of Scotland tartan. And I'm not going to say very much more because we're going to dig into all these amazing things that Zoe has done today. Thanks for joining us, Zoe. How are you today?
I'm good, thanks. All the better for hearing that lovely introduction. You sometimes forget when you're busy, don't you, the amount of things you've actually done.
Absolutely. And actually, it's amazing for me remembering that I've known your podcast since the beginning and it was
Yeah,
only 2020
I
and all of
know.
the incredible things that you've achieved in that time. It's absolutely inspiring.
I remember a very early conversation with you at Pitlochry at the Winter Words Festival. We had a conversation and I said, we have to get you on. We're going to do this podcast and you'd be perfect. And of course, you're one of our very earliest interviewees.
I know it's a proper honour. I didn't actually realise I was such an early interviewee, I don't think.
I'm not lying, Mary, when I say to you that Claire and I had no idea that this would actually go anywhere, really, to be honest. So this is all quite surprising and bizarre to us.
Well, that's a nice lead in to my first question today, which really is, how did you first become aware of Scotland's dreadful history of witch persecution? And how did you then decide that you wanted to campaign for a pardon and an apology?
Well, first of all, I have to be really honest and say to you that I knew nothing at all. I've learned through this through Claire. So Claire came up with the idea, a combination of her work as a human rights lawyer and research she was doing with that, and then understanding what had happened with the witch trials in Scotland and recognizing that they were, one of our greatest human rights issues in Scotland's history, and realizing that she wanted to bring that to the public because we didn't know about it. I mean, you were lucky if you got taught about it in school, and it was probably down to having a teacher who was maybe quite passionate about it for some reason. But I mean, I grew up in Northeast Fife. It's funny when you read out the introduction, you said, born in Lancashire and then raised in Scotland. Until very recently, I've always just quite happily said I'm Scottish. And it's recent, recent sort of atmospheres, people have went, oh, some people have said, but you were born in England, you're not Scottish, which is a really interesting thing to me. It's really bizarre. Because my mum is Scottish, my entire family are Scottish. I just happened to be born in England because my dad was working down there. He was a Geordie, so he's maybe kind of the fly in the ointment. But as I was growing up, were not brought up with a terribly Scottish upbringing. So even though we were, I didn't know anything about the myths of Scotland. And when I was sort of handed into the education system, I went to school in Newport, the little village in Northeast Fife, and then I went to high school at Madras and St Andrews. And we were taught nothing really at all about Scotland's history other than how the Industrial Revolution
Mm,
made people rich, how the machines worked, and about the First World War, but really from the point of view about the trenches.
mm.
Very, very little about the human side of history. And I did history right up to the end of sixth year. And in sixth year, I chose to do the American Civil War. And so I knew a great amount about the transatlantic slave trade because that's what I was really interested in. But I didn't know anything really about my own country's history. So when I first met Claire, Claire and I, we bonded about our sense of humour is very similar in lots of ways. She's maybe not as childish as I am, but we have got a very similar sense of humour. That's just working with teenagers for 25 years. You have to have it. But we both loved podcasts, particularly true crime podcasts. And Claire had already had the idea. I didn't know anything about this. And she'd said to me, "Oh, can we have coffee? And I've got an idea I want to run past you." And I, of course, said yes. And she said to me, "Right, I want to do this campaign about the witch trials in Scotland." And I was kind of like, "What witch trials in Scotland?" And I knew Scotland was witchy. I knew Scotland was ghosty. Like I liked stories about the supernatural. I had a sense of like the haunted nature of buildings of Scotland, but I didn't know anything about like the real and true story about witches. And I taught, this is slightly shameful, I taught Macbeth many times. I love Macbeth as a play, but I didn't really make the connection between the reality of witch trials beyond the idea that I knew that James was currying favour, sorry, Shakespeare was currying favour with James, but I had no sense of how that connected to Scotland's history. So for me, it's actually been super useful because it means that when we interview people, we were starting off from a position where Claire knew a bit and I knew nothing. And it means that we, like the listener of the podcast, are able to ask like just normal questions that normal people would ask that are not academics that know about these things. So it's funny because the podcast starts off really from a point of complete ignorance on my part. And I probably ask quite a lot of what maybe I now think are quite stupid questions. But obviously there are no stupid questions. But we've really gone on this huge learning journey. So I knew nothing. And I'm certainly not an expert now. And Claire and I keep making the point to people, we're not historians. We're absolutely not claiming that. We're two angry women that, can see the parallels between the witch trials of Scotland and the way that women are still treated today. And it's just come into even clearer focus in the last, I'd say, 6 months.
Yeah. It's absolutely fascinating that I think much of what you've said there sort of chimes with actually the mission of the Saltire Society, which is to make sure that people in Scotland are actually able to access understanding of Scottish history because it helps to contextualise, aside from anything else, it helps to contextualise the situations in which we find ourselves today and gives us some of those tools. So, that's, I think, a kind of powerful
Uh-huh.
thing to hear you say that wasn't something you had. I should also confess, Zoe, to anyone listening, that I once interviewed you live on stage, and I think I said you were from Lanarkshire, and
Oh,
then you said no,
oh,
it was Lancashire, and
yeah.
I was
Two
really
different focuses.
surprised.
But when I first started writing fiction, I mean, I always knew since I was a little girl that I wanted to write stories. But it really, when I wrote my first novel, which I haven't published yet, that's still sort of sitting, as people tend to have. But I didn't know where to set that. I felt a much bigger connection with America. My grandmother lived in America. She was Glaswegian, but I used to spend a lot of time over there. Really loved America and couldn't really see how to set it in Scotland. And then I reached a point where I went to do an M.Lit in creative writing. And I just started to think, well, maybe I'll just set it in Dundee, a version of Dundee. And then it sort of flowed. But before that, I didn't really feel that connection in the same way with fiction because I read a lot of American fiction. So I think part of that as well is that I just wasn't really exposed to it in school or part of my degree. I've got an English degree, but there's very little Scottish writing that we looked at, and I think arguably there's reasons for that. There's reasons why we didn't get taught our own history. And I think that it's heartening to see now that that's definitely changed. I can see it in school. Scottish history is being taught, and I know that the witch trials are now being taught much more than they ever were because people get in touch with us now and say, I'm using your podcast to do this in school, or this gave me an idea to cover this, even in primary school. So that's heartening because we need to understand where we've come from. Like how can we ever really be the best versions of ourselves if we don't understand what's come before?
Absolutely. And I think the witch trials, there's something, it's a kind of dark observation, but they also give us some insight into women's lives who
Yeah.
tend to be absent. Ordinary folk, and particularly ordinary women, tend to be absent from the story, but we can actually, in that, what we have in the way of the records, we can get hold of some women's voices, can't we? And
Yeah.
start to understand a little bit about their world.
And it's particularly grim and it's horrible. As you're saying there, people that had money and status were more likely, obviously, to be literate, but their stories are recorded much more. Often the women are just because they're bit parts of the men's stories, but we have got a bit more of an idea there. But with ordinary women, it's very little, isn't there? And it's
Absolutely.
it's interesting to think about what the landscape must have been like in these periods, particularly during the five different peaks of what it meant to be a woman. Because despite the fact we've had the odd historian, usually men, well, always men, saying to us it wasn't gendered, I mean, it was 84% of those in Scotland who were accused were women. I really don't think there's another way to read that. And I don't think that's just like a hardcore feminist reading of it. I think that's fairly straightforward. And it's complicated. It's not just they went, right, women, witches. There was lots of other stuff going on. But I mean, James wrote in Demonology that women were weaker, and that's why the devil was able to get in about them, because they didn't know as much as men did. They weren't as strong as men were morally or intellectually. So for me, that's baked in that the focus was on women.
And there's a prurience often, I think, in the charges
Oh,
that it's interesting. And an idea of women, it's a very sexualized
oh,
picture of women.
very sexualized. The idea that until they meet the devil, they're maybe more the way that men want them to be in line with the Bible, but they're not enough of where men want them to be for their own sexual desires. So when they get accused of being a witch, it's like all bets are off, and then they're like, right, you're akin almost to an animal at this point because they've been dehumanized. Because once the devil's taken them on board, they've kind of lost their essential selves in some way. And then you can start saying things about them like, well, you had sex with the devil, tell us about that. And it's quite gross, actually.
Mm, really horrible.
Hmm.
Listening to you speak, is really powerful. And that I think has been, such a big part of your campaign is the podcast, the opportunity to hear you telling these stories, hearing the stories, exploring the stories. Was a podcast always central to the project? And how did that kind of come about? It was also around the time of lockdown, wasn't it?
Yeah, so all these things kind of came together and made the monster that is the Witches of Scotland podcast, because it was always going to be a podcast. And when Claire and I had that very first conversation, I said, sure, I'd like to do my own podcast, but I don't want to do just a straightforward books one because there's lots of them. I want to do something that had like a different angle to it. And anybody that knows me knows that I love to talk. It's definitely something that I'm quite fond of. And I also quite often am working out what I'm thinking about things as I'm talking, which is not always a good thing. But I think it is good for a podcast where you're talking to experts and then you can kind of work out where you are with these things as you go. So that's been really interesting. And initially we were only going to do 6 episodes because Claire had this idea that six would be enough. That would cover, all the major facts, and then we would just really lean into getting the apology and the pardon and the memorial. But as you said, we launched, and then a couple of weeks later we went into lockdown. So people didn't really have much to do. I mean, I was going into school, I think maybe once or twice a week. We had to go in and kind of run these hubs. It just feels like a million years ago now. And Claire was still working from home, but it meant that people that ordinarily I don't think would have agreed to speak to us, or certainly wouldn't have done it swiftly. We would have had to put in, can you fit this in around lectures or writing tours, whatever. We're probably quite kind of like, yeah, that'll give me something to do and I can talk about my subject. So people were open to talking to us. Plus, everybody became au fait with Zoom, didn't they? I mean, everybody
Mm.
started to live their lives through Zoom, so that just became a very easy thing to use. And anybody that's been interviewed by us will know that we don't do things in a professional way, really. We've just got Macs open, we just record it on there. We've never had mics, we don't wear headphones. So when other people get us to come on their shows and they're always like, when have you got this? And we're kind of like, no. It's meant to just be very natural and chatty and just sort of just like people having a conversation. And I think that's why it's been so popular, is because it is relaxed and it's serious when it needs to be serious, but we're also both able to have, fun moments in the times where that's appropriate. And I think that that's a very Scottish thing. And I think that that's something that you need as a woman to be able to get through womanhood, because if you didn't laugh about it, I think you would just lie down on the road and cry. But we've done that very not deliberately because it's natural, but that's something that we think is a real plus point of the podcast.
You told me, I seem to recall, that one or other of you was either sitting on or leaning on a washing machine.
That
when
was
we
the
were
very first
recording?
one that we did. So I've got this kind of basement in my house. Not really the basement, but that's what we call it. It's on a lower level, and that's where my washing machine is. And I don't know why that we thought we must have in our foolish minds thought that this resembled a studio more than any other room. And at that point, I still had three kids at home as well. So it was probably away from those guys. And was just maybe a quieter point. But like Claire's iPhone was propped up on my washing machine, which was off, and we recorded the first little bit in there. And anybody that listens to it, I mean, it is fairly shambolic at first, and it's less shambolic now, I would say. Not making any great claims to it's shambolic.
And it runs to, you're on about episode 81, is that right?
I think so. I think that's the last one that we put out. And they've all got a similar structure. Claire and I do like an intro, and we always remember people that were accused, and we give as much detail as we can. And as you know yourself, Mary, a lot of the details very scant.
Mhm.
One of the more shocking moments that we had while we were working on this was discovering that there was at least one listing where it just said sundry witches, and there was no number even, and certainly no names or details. So we move around different areas. If we can tie it in with the guest, we do that. And sometimes it's just something catches our eye. But we remember people, not just women, but obviously mostly women, because the stats in each episode, we do a kind of a news roundup. And then we get into the interview with whoever the specialist is. Often it's a historian, sometimes it's a fiction writer, sometimes it's a musician or a visual artist or a campaigner. And then we then do a finish where we just, some of it's quite like nonsense at the end. And that's us sort of the outro as well. So it's got a similar sort of structure each time, which is good because I think if we change, Claire and I both get really confused. So we don't write really any notes. It's certainly not, we don't have a producer, it's just the two of us. So we just kind of go, oh, here's some stuff in the news, you talk about that, I'll talk about this. And then we don't plan any questions for the specialist. No, we don't plan anything. I mean, because I do, as you said before, I do interviews at book festivals. I don't plan for them either. I just read the book and then just turn up and we have a conversation. And that's really deliberate because if the way that my brain works, if I plan it and then if it was to go off, then I'd probably get into a bit of a flap. So it's easier just to react to what happens as we're on stage.
That's fascinating. And I do, as you know, Zoe, I do some of that similar work, chairing events. And I think there's a lot to be said actually for that approach because it is a true conversation. If if
Yeah,
if 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 one begins with a series of questions, and full disclosure, I have a series of questions here, but they're fairly broad. There's a level to which that dictates where a conversation goes. And obviously, for
yeah,
some people, that puts them at their ease. But for
yeah.
others, and I know you and I have had conversations on stage that have gone quite wild on occasions, but I think hopefully in an entertaining
It's
way.
so much more interesting. It's so much more interesting. And because my career is as an English teacher, secondary English teacher, largely with difficult classes, largely with boys, then there's no better battleground training really for that because everything just you can have the best plans in the world, but everything kind of goes awry. So it's just really enjoyable to me. It's nice. I want people to come away from an event that I've been chairing where they've thought, well, that was a really interesting conversation that I almost just kind of eavesdropped on. I like that sort of an idea.
Yeah, and in a way, the online format really lends itself, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's more intimate in a sense. During the period when you were first launching, everything just about went online in that way, and
Yeah.
it was a very different set of conversations, very different connections, I think.
Yes, yeah. And we had, it's quite difficult to think back to that time and sort of remember it because I run on a what's happening now sort of a basis. But I do remember at the time thinking there's this pall of death over everything. We didn't know, like we were going out to work in school and coming home and like stripping off and jumping in the shower and putting your clothes straight in the washing machine. And you didn't know if you were bringing something into the house. And there was that fear all the time. So I think it was great to have a distraction, but it was a distraction that's really about death, but
Yeah.
like state sanctioned death and sort of fear and I think there was a parallel there for us where there was at the times of the peaks of the witch trials, and I'm sure in between there would have been that idea of, you could be accused and sent to your death. There was a not the same, but like a similar impending doom
Mm.
that must have hung over people and particularly populations of women. So I think there was definitely something there that kind of knitted together.
And something interesting too about the idea, perhaps, that witch persecutions were wont to happen during periods of other kinds of disruption. It was perhaps whether or not
Absolutely.
people expressly thought it, pointing over
Yeah.
there was quite handy.
For sure, plague, pestilence, war, mini ice age, all, and just the very difficult nature of life for many people during these points. But we see it now, like the cost of living goes up. There's a drive for horribly aimed political parties that don't seem to have any policies other than, well, we don't like brown people, and we're just going to keep Scotland white for Scottish white women, white men and women. And I was talking to a friend at the weekend, and I was saying about there was something had come up, a reform candidate who was talking about taxing childless women, taxing child-free women. And I was saying, because ultimately the game plan is following that American game plan, which is for women to leave the workforce, to be at home and to breed white babies. And he sort of laughed at me. And then there was another piece in the news later, and he was like, it was a discussion thing on Sunday morning on the BBC. And the way the guy was speaking there, it was absolutely dovetailing into that. And I don't think it's paranoid for women to notice these things that are happening. We can see the clutch there is in our bodily autonomy, which I can't believe in 2026 we're still talking about. It's wild to me. So I think that the prevailing sort of social thoughts plus social worry about money and safety and so on leads to then finding a victim that you can scapegoat, because if you get rid of them, then everything will be fine. So during the witch trials, it was people that had been taken in by the devil. If we got rid of them, then everything would go back to being nice and calm and, religiously, observant, and everything would be okay. And I think we see the same thing happening now. And it's fascinating and bizarre to us that we're hundreds of years ahead and it's still the same mechanism that happens. But I think that's humans.
Patterns and
Yeah,
something eternal in human behavior. That's
exactly.
absolutely fascinating. I wanted to ask about, uh, against everything that we've just said, you achieve something amazing in the podcast and in your events, which is that you hold this incredibly difficult history and the incredibly difficult resonances that it has today. But there's a real joy and an exuberance in what you do. And I wanted to ask how you do that, how you look after yourself and
I
yourselves.
Claire and I have a fantastic relationship. Like we're the happiest non-married couple that there ever has been, and we get on great together. I'm pretty glass half full. Claire's got so much in the glass that the glass doesn't even exist. She's like bananas positive. I'm sure she won't mind me saying that to you. But we both feel that it's not a done deal, that just because people have done things a certain way in the past, it doesn't mean that we have to keep repeating it that way. And what's been extremely cool for us has been connecting with these different listeners and readers who get the idea of what it is that we're trying to do. Like I think genuinely think there are more good people in the world. And I think that we just need to harness the power of that and really remember that we do live essentially in a democracy and that we need to be involved in local politics, and we need to keep focusing on the stuff that really matters, and looking after families, looking after children. Like in a matriarchy, we'd be focusing on the children. If women ran things, there'd be less wars, because you wouldn't want, I'm saying this as a mother, and I know that's not all women's experience, but you wouldn't want your son to die in a war. We would be thinking that. We wouldn't be thinking about who's got the biggest, bank balance. We would be thinking a lot more, I'm being polite, a lot more about what is the future? What do we want the future to look like? And we meet people all the time, men as well as women, at events that we do, who have got a similar mindset, or who are thinking, right, okay, well, not everything is doom and gloom. We're all activists. We can all campaign. We can all push for a fairer society.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for all you've been doing.
It's a total pleasure though. Like it is a pleasure because it's really positive, and Claire and I are both pretty chippy, so I think that we both like having something that we can get our teeth into. My gran is 96 and she's still alive despite it all. And her maiden name is McClanders. And Claire and I've got this ongoing joke about like the McClanders spirit, because she's a right tough cookie. So I just always think I'm just channeling that McClanders kind of the rage, and I think that we in Scotland, we certainly used to have a very strong socialist Ben, I mean, look at the amount of people that went over, for example, to the Spanish Civil War. Like we were people that wanted to make a difference in the world, and I think we can totally get that back on track again.
Yeah, that's a radical kind of movement. That's
Yep.
here, here. On in terms of the stories that you've heard and the stories that you've told, um, thinking about the real stories, such as they can be determined, is there any particular story, any particular witch who really stays with you?
I think probably the Lilius AD
Mm.
story in Fife does, because I'm from Fife. And Lilius was an older woman. I mean, like I probably really seen as really quite an old woman at her time. She'd have been around in her 70s. And she was accused once and then was found not guilty and then was accused some years later. And she confessed while she was in captivity essentially. And then she died before they could kill her. And it left them with a problem because normally what you would do is if you had a confessed witch, you'd go to trial, you'd find her guilty, then the state would execute her, but the minister and his people and the people of the community, they would hang her and then burn her body. And one of the reasons for that was the disposal of the body meant that the devil couldn't reanimate the corpse because there was this idea, kind of like a proto-zombie idea, that the devil was in charge of the body. It was like a puppet, and that if you didn't get rid of the body, then he could have this reveneer that could still go about their kind of evil bidding. So the community was left with this difficult problem of what to do with Lilius's body. So they buried her in a big box, not really a coffin, but a big box that they put out on the shoreline so that running water was going over it. And you'll know better than me, Mary, but there's that idea in Scots mythology that the devil can't cross running water. And they had her buried out there to try and keep her away from the community. And then it was forgotten about for a long time. I think probably quite deliberately, because once people stopped accusing people of being witches, there must have been some sort of shame about what the community had done to this old woman, I would imagine. That's a kind reading, I think. And then her grave was disturbed sometime later in the Victorian times by grave robbers who were there to get things of interest out of the grave, because of course it was during the time of the great collecting period of the Victorians. And her skull was taken and some of her bones and some of the wood from the box. And some of the wood was made into walking sticks, two of them, which were ultimately presented to Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie, who'd come from the area. And they both, I think, reside in the museum, the Carnegie Museum in Dunfermline. So people can go and have a look at that, which is very eerie. And her skull and some of her bones were photographed in the early stages of photography. Her skull went on show at I always get this wrong, the Empire show.
An
So
exhibition, yeah.
yeah, thank you. So the last time it was seen was I think in maybe the 30s, something like that, and her skull has been missing ever since. I'm sure it's in some rich person's collection somewhere, and we'll never see it again. But because things have been photographed, we fast forward right up to very recent past, she was the photographs that they had in Dundee University and their research there, where it's about, victim identification. They do some really amazing work there. They were able to put together, the forensic artists, an idea of what Lilius looked like, an idea of how tall she was. So she was pretty tall for a woman of her age. She was quite toothy, and there are photographs that you can see online. And I think seeing an idea of what one of these women that were accused looked like really, really brought it home. I mean, we obviously already knew these were real people. These weren't just made up stories. They were real people. And we always try to give them back their dignity. And that's why we remember them in the podcast. But to actually have a picture of a woman looking back at you, it makes it so much more real. And just to think about what it must have been like for her to be an old woman on her own with no protector, being accused and then meeting her fate in prison, essentially, and the way that the community just turned against her, a really small community, and what that means for how people are able to dehumanize somebody that they've always known. I mean, these would be communities where everybody would have known her, and that people can then go, oh, well, we can do terrible things to her now because the devil's taken her, and losing the idea of who Lilius AD was as a human is really horribly fascinating to me. So I think that story lives on in my mind.
And if anybody listening would like to go to where Lilius Eadie's grave was, it's Torryburn in Fife. It's in the intertidal space. There's a huge slab of sandstone, which I think was part of the idea was that that would keep her
Yeah,
down,
he
as
burned
you
people
say,
down.
that the body wouldn't go walking.
Yeah, and I believe it was Dr. Louise Yeoman and also Doug, the archaeologist, Doug Spears, who went out looking because they had an idea of where it might be. So it was very recently that the grave was rediscovered. And now, of course, because there's an increased interest in these people's stories, there was local people that fundraised to make plaques that are on the ground there, so you can go and see it. So I think it's really important to memorialize people and remember them as people, and that we really need to be active about remembering things so they don't get repeated.
Absolutely. I'm interested to ask you about your audience insofar as obviously when you're doing events, you know who your audience are, you can see them. It's a little more difficult to know who's picking up a book. But
Mhm.
I'm interested in how much you know about who listens and who engages. I'm interested to ask whether the majority are women
Yeah.
and whether there's a difference between live events and the podcast and the books, if you know that.
I think unsurprisingly is largely women. Not only women, we do get men that come to events too, and they're not just men that have been dragged along by their partners or sisters or whatever, but it is largely women. And it's largely women that are probably between the ages, I would say, of late 20s right up. There's a lot of women that would be around about mine, Claire's age. So I'm 50. Claire is, I think it's okay to say she's 54. I think there's 4 years between us. I think that's what it is. But she and I would be pretty representative of the audience. So a lot of women that I think have really discovered their rage. And I know that maybe sounds a bit silly in some ways, but I think there's definitely a tie-in with like perimenopause and just reaching a point where you just kind of go, do you know what? That's it. That's the giddy limit. I've reached the end of the line. And people who then get very involved in it and really think, yeah, that could have been me. That the idea that somebody could have picked on me in my community, pretty much all of us can access the idea how quickly things could turn. So I think that our audience is largely kind of like us and older. But not only that, I mean, we have much younger readers. We have readers in lots in the States, unsurprisingly, lots in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but we get contacted a lot by people in France and Germany and Spain. And the book's coming out in translation in Egypt and in Turkey, which we're both quite kind of taken aback by. So that's quite interesting. Hopefully there'll be other translations too. But it's quite a broad topic, and I think because we're really clear about the links between then and now, and about how women have always been second-class citizens from way before that. I mean, this is back to Eve and the apple, and that we've not really moved beyond that in many significant ways. So I think most women can kind of tap into that and say, right, okay, I'm getting involved now.
And this is probably a slightly naughty question because I think I might know a little bit of the answer. Um, you've said the book's been translated into various languages. You've been in the States. You've been kind of further afield.
Mhm.
But does the story transfer south of the border? We have this complex book market in the UK where the home
Yeah.
market is the whole of the UK and Ireland.
Yeah,
Do you find that there is an interest and an uptake in Scottish history right across the UK, or is there a difficulty in making it travel?
I think the only difficulty in making it travel is the book industry understanding that people out with Scotland are also interested in Scotland. Okay, so I don't think there's an issue with understanding America and Canada or New Zealand, and to an extent Australia are interested. But I think the idea about England is really interesting. I was talking to another writer, I'll not name her, actually just before I came in on here. She actually said there's a glass ceiling, but there's also a glass border. That this idea that because we are the witches of Scotland, that's the campaign name, which at some point we'd like to change to the women of Scotland when we get that legal thing overturned, and then they were never witches in the first place. But I think there is this idea that if you've got Scotland in the title, that only Scottish people are interested. But we know that's not true. And when we get to events, we've done tons of events in Scotland. We could have travelled right across America and Canada. America's on pause at the moment for pretty clear political reasons, but we're going to do lots of stuff in Canada. we know that there's an interest, and we know when we do stuff in England. We've got lots of English podcast listeners, got lots of readers who get in touch with us, but they have to order online a lot of the time because it's not necessarily present in bookshops. So I think there's an idea, and I think this is a false idea, perhaps, that there's only room for a few Scots.
All
So
right.
because Nicola Sturgeon had a book out, and Claire and I are in London fairly frequently because Claire works down there, and then we'll do meetings and things down there, and we go to the same bookshop because it's near where we stay. And Darren McGarvey's book's been there solidly, and Nicola's book's been there solidly, and they've never had our book, right? We always check because we're just gonks. So we like to know where things are. But I think that it's something where if people don't see it, why would you then go and look it up? You know, it would pique your interest because we know that the witch subject area is incredibly interesting. But I mean, look at the documentaries that have been made. So Lucy Worsley made a documentary about witches, and they got in touch with us at a production team. They didn't. We then put them in touch with a friend and historian, Judith Langland Scott, who was on the show. She's great. She does really good work. And then Rylan made a programme about the witches in England. And Suran Jones made a programme about witches in England, and they interviewed Claire for that one for sort of the legal perspective. But there's not been a good, big Scottish documentary. We've been approached by various companies, but as you'll know this yourself, Mary, it's about them then getting the funding lined up for it. But there's a huge appetite for it. I mean, we're reaching the point now with the two of us thinking out, well, we'll just start our own production company. How hard can it be to make a TV series? I mean, people do it all the time. How hard can it be? That tends to be our policy for things generally. But it seems ridiculous to me that it's not been made. And this is a horrible boast, we killed more people in Scotland in 1 year than England did across the entirety of their witch trials. Right now, I mean, obviously that's not a great flex, but there's a huge amount of history that we know that people will be interested in. People come to Scotland all the time to do like Outlander tours. They come to do sort of like horrible history type tours. They come because they have a notion that they're descended from accused witches. So we know there's a huge appetite, but it's actually getting the money in place to go, right, people will actually watch this.
And that's really,
Frustrating.
and that kind of in a way takes us back to something you said at the very beginning, which is we've not been that brilliant ourselves at telling our own history and ensuring
Yeah.
that we know our own history or we can access our own literature. Say the glory days in the 90s of Canongate reissuing all of
Mhm.
those brilliant Canongate classics, so the writing of Willa Muir or Naomi Mitchison or all of those fabulous writers of all sorts of eras was easily
Yeah,
accessible to the general public. I think some of it might be to do with the way that commercial conglomeration and globalization are working. But
exactly.
there's a
Yeah.
there's a job to do, isn't there, to sell. And
Yeah.
I use that, I don't use that necessarily in a commercial sense. The idea that these stories are actually relevant wherever you are in the UK.
Yeah, because you got the double whammy of being Scottish and being a woman. You know, those two things together mean that maybe, there's an idea that the audience isn't there. But I mean, we do still make up 50%, maybe more, of the population as women. You know, I do think there's always an appetite for women's stories. And the story of the witch trials is incredibly compelling. You know, I don't see why, for me, it's a non-brainer. I think it'd be really good. What I wouldn't want to see would be, an enjoyment of women being tortured. I hate when
No.
you see those things and there's reenactments and it's the woman is just in degradation and all the rest of it. I hate that. I hate when there's historical offerings. Like there's a so-called museum where a lot of it is about putting women in the torture devices when they're visiting. That's repulsive to me, and I think that you wouldn't see that if it was any sort of historical visiting that you would do about, say, the Holocaust or about the transatlantic slave trade. You wouldn't do a playing dress up aspect to it. And again, I think it's women's history that it's kind of because the idea of the witch is kind of comical. It's become comical over time. And it's become, not about her just being somebody that's to be feared, but over time to control that fear. I think what's happened is that she's changed from a feared figure to a figure of fun to a great extent. And with a small offshoot of sexy witch, I blame Burns for that with Tam
Annie.
Shelter. Yeah, like the sexy witch kind of trope. But I think largely it's a way of diminishing older women and just going, they're ugly, they're not fertile, they're no longer useful, who'd want to have sex with them anyway? And it's a way of, sort of putting older women in a box and trying to kind of like nullify their power. that I feel we're at a time now where women actually are kind of embracing this idea about haggitude. There's obviously that kind of line or the idea about actually I would like to live in the forest in a cottage made of bones where the local children are frightened of me. I want to live with my cat and just read books. Like there, and I think there is an embracing now of women for that kind of an idea.
I love that. I hadn't really thought about that, Zoe. And I would really like Baba Yaga's house. I would love a house with chicken legs that you could move
Amazing.
off with on the
Fantastic. I mean,
regular.
like Claire and I talk about these sort of things all the time. The idea about becoming kind of, traveling, just and not being bound by things, I think is really interesting. My youngest child is hopefully soon going to be leaving home to move to Glasgow, where the other two are, and then I'll be an empty nester. So, I can do whatever I like. I can travel and do things. And I just think that more and more women are waking up to the idea about, okay, so life doesn't need to be the way that we've been sold since the 1950s, particularly, and that life can be really changeable. And I think the way that people's work's really changing, there is a semi benefit to that. And I think that that all ties in with like perimenopause or women younger understanding the perimenopause is coming down the pipeline towards them and actually how freeing the idea of that can be instead of fearing it and going, oh no, what will I do? Just kind of going, I mean, Claire and I were talking about setting up a Witches of Scotland tiny home women's community because we read about a woman in America who she retired and she got her pension and she built like something like 12 tiny homes and she received applications from all across the United States and all these women live together in community. And it means somebody can take them to medical appointments. So if somebody's unwell, they can bring their shop in, that they can hang out together, they can share books and music and hang out when they feel like hanging out. And I think there's something to be pretty interesting to look at with that sort of idea.
Absolutely. I know it's a sort of slightly unserious observation, but whenever I'm talking about or hearing about witches in that sort of way that they've been used, kind of almost as figures of fun, I always think about Terry Pratchett's witches, who are just the wisest, cleverest group of women at all levels of society, doing all sorts of good. And
Yeah,
it's just, but also living very full lives. And I
yeah,
think there's
yeah.
something
I
wonderful
think
to
it's
say about
very
that.
alluring. I think it's very alluring.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I want to ask a bit about the tartan.
Mhm.
So can you tell us a wee bit about how the Witches of Scotland tartan came about?
So initially, you'll know we still have three aims. So the apology, which was given in 2022 by Nicola Sturgeon when she was First Minister, which was really important because it meant it was being taken seriously for the first time, and it was clear that there had been a miscarriage of justice. The pardon, which had got to a point where it was going to go to a private member's bill, and then the MSP that was doing it, Natalie Dawn, was promoted to cabinet. You're no longer allowed to do a private member's bill. So that's on pause until after the local elections, and then we'll identify or working on identifying another MSP to take that forward. But the public just start looking at see what the level of responses has been done, and there was a huge amount of support for it. Thousands of people got back in touch. There was cross-party support. It'd all been discussed in Scottish Parliament. So hopefully it shouldn't take much. Bearing in mind there's been two of these kind of pardons before, one for men that had been convicted of same-sex illegality, and one for men during the miners' strike. And so it exists. And according to Claire, our legal expert, it's a tiny piece of writing that she's already done. That's all it does. And all it does is, unlike our idea of American films about people being exonerated, the way the law functions in Scotland means that it would be basically overturning their conviction and saying there is no such thing as witches. These people weren't witches. They shouldn't have ever been accused. And I should say, as a kind of a sidebar here, we're not talking about witches as people would identify themselves now. Like they exist, and that's cool. And we've got lots of support from witches. We ourselves are not witches, but there's a really nice positive relationship there. The witches that we're referring to in law in Scotland were people that were working in league with the devil, very deliberately, that they were people that had been taken over by the devil to do evil, right? So that's very, very clear and different. I mean, I don't want to get into a big religious conversation here, but I don't think that these things are provable. Okay, so that's kind of the basis that we're coming from. But the third thing was always going to be the third part of the campaign was about memorializing those people that had been accused, the men and the women. And so we spoke to various people that had been involved with memorializations in smaller ways in communities, bigger memorializations for other issues. And it became something where when we approached the Scottish Government, they said, we support you, but we don't have any money. And the two of us thought, well, we don't want to fundraise for that. We don't want a committee for that. That's a huge job. Plus, it became more and more obvious to us that where was the natural place to have a memorial? You know, there were accusations right across Scotland. Everything always happens in the Central Belt, and sometimes there's good reasons for that. You know, I'd quite like the idea that tourists might just chancely come across it and learn, but that was all kind of problematic. And also, we know what happened with the Elsie Ingalls statue in Edinburgh, the proposed one for that. We know the way that women are represented in statuary. So it started to become a bit like, oh, I don't want one that's like a young girl whose dress is falling off her lovely bosom and she's sort of looking out winsomely. We wanted it to be something that would be like the one they have in Stilneset in Norway that Louise Bourgeois was commissioned, her last piece of work, which is amazing, which uses fire and mirrors and chairs. And by the way, they had a much, much, much smaller group of people that were accused, I think in the tens, not in the thousands. But they had their oil money, so they were able to actually do really important civic things, unlike here. So we would like to see something that was of that scale, but that's really difficult and really complicated. Who pays for it? Who looks after it? We don't want to be the sort of the keepers of the statue forever and ever. And then Claire went, well, both of us actually went to the tartan opening party at the V&A in Dundee, which I can see from my window, which my oldest friend Leonie Bell is the director of. So we were lucky enough to get an invite to that. And there was loads of people there dressed in tartan. And Claire observed that people were saying, oh, where's your tartan from? What story does that tell? And she just had this brainwave of, if we commissioned a tartan, that's something that's really obviously very Scottish. It's something that could then symbolise the people that were accused, and that'd be a really interesting thing to do. So Leonie put us in touch with Claire Campbell, who owns and runs Prickly Thistle, the mill in the Highlands in Inverness. And we spoke to Claire, and it was a fantastic process because Claire's just a total force of good anyway. She's so energetic. She came back with a few different designs, and Claire and I looked at the one that we went for and both immediately went, that's the one. So it's largely black. It's got red and grey and white and pink through it, but it's really a very striking tartan. And all the colours and the thread counts and the size of the different squares, they all symbolise different aspects. So I'll focus on the colours for this, but the black aspect is that it's the dark times. The grey represents the fact that these women and men were reduced to ashes. The pinky red is the legal tapes. So when we talk about being wrapped up in red tape, that's what we're talking about. That existed then, and it still exists now to a certain extent, although Claire tells me it's mostly emails now, which is probably unsurprising. But it symbolises the fact that these accusations were absolutely done with the state and the law. So this wasn't, villagers at dawn with pitchforks. This was lawyers and courts and legal precedent and following the rules to a certain extent. And it just shows that when the church and the state get together, really terrible things can happen. So that was very important to us. That was reflected. So we had it designed. This was a completely new world to both of us. It was then registered online, the Scottish Register of Tartans. I'm saying, I mean, you maybe didn't know that either. I certainly didn't. You probably do know that. So there's the register. And then it turns out that there are people around the world, particularly in America, who watch that like a hawk to see what new tartans are being developed. So I was at the gym one day and I got a text from somebody, it was Gemma Clark, who's a great supporter. And she said, is this you guys? And it was somebody on Facebook had said, here's the new Witches of Scotland tartan. And I was like, well, yeah, but we've not released that. We've not done any thought about how we're going to tell people about it. And we had to very quickly decide what we were going to do with this because it went viral. And we decided to do a Kickstarter and just get a few out. We didn't think there would be that much interest, but it sold out our first stretch within 45 minutes. And then within the first day, we then had a much more adventurous sort of idea. And then we ended up doubling it. And it was just completely bonkers. And then we opened up an online shop in July. And it's just been really steady because people understand that they want to wear a piece of this kind of history. But we have so many people getting in touch with us that have bought scarves in America who live in Minnesota that have been wearing it to face off against ICE agents. I mean, that is mind-blowing to the two of us, that this symbolic fabric has been taken from women, and it is largely women, but not only, we have men buying kilts too, who have said, I identify with what it is you're saying here. I've got a moment in the day now where I have to put my money where my mouth is. If I thought that I'd be somebody that would be accused then, and if I think I'd be somebody that would stick up for the vulnerable then, I have to do this now. And it's just really like humbling to be involved in that in any way.
That's amazing. And lovely too to have that tribute to woolwork.
Oh, it's
And
wild.
I know that you're very clear that that it was about 85% female victims and
Mhm.
men suffered persecution too.
Yep.
Um, but I think one of the things about our concepts of art through the ages have not really seen craft
Yeah.
work as being of kind of this of high status, and often the things that women are doing become invisible. And again, that's not to say that textile work, and particularly tartan and weaving and tweed, is all about women, but
Yeah.
there is a big link between women and textile work.
What
And
What's really beautiful about it is that Claire's Mill, it was a small team, I think, of 15 people, all but one were women. The man that they work with is somebody who used to work because she set up that mill. She set up Prickly Thistle because I think it was 30 years that there hadn't been a mill in the Highlands making tartan. And Claire she was an accountant and she retrained and decided, I'm going to do it, I'm going to set this up. And the man that works with them, I believe, used to work when there was a mill in the Highlands. So he's their kind of technical expert for how the machines work, because the machines are really old. I
mm,
mean, this is not like super, it's not printing technology. These are things being made in a very sustainable, very traditional, very labor intensive. It takes a long time. So when people pre-order something, they have to tick a box saying, I understand this is going to take up to 6 months. And people are largely amazing about that and understand what they're doing. But Claire's had to employ two new people and then I think another three new people. And one of the women that she's employed, I believe, is a young woman who has graduated from textiles, I think in Galashiels, thought she'd have to live in Edinburgh, Glasgow, or London to do her work. But now she's been able to move back to where she's from and still do the thing that she's trained and that's her passion. And that's amazing to us. The idea that it's giving women work, that it's keeping something in the Highlands, that it's meaningful to Scotland. So we're really, really strict about it. We don't let, nobody else has permission to make it. We have no intention of letting anybody else make it for the foreseeable future. We want it made by Claire and her team in the Highlands because it's made to such an incredibly high standard. So, I mean, we could be getting it made in, there's various mills in Pakistan that have tried to rip us off. That's been a whole eye-opening thing. A few people in America have tried to do it, but I mean, as a KC, like she's not going to let stuff like that go. So we're quite dogged about whack-a-moling things that come up, but it's been really eye-opening to us as well about what it must be like to be, an artisan anywhere, but particularly in Scotland, that's trying to make things that are very specifically your idea, and how quickly bigger businesses rip them off and make them much more poorly, but then can get them to people really quickly. So it means that people that want to actually get the tartan have to be sort of on board with the mission of what it is that we're doing, and they are, which is just really amazing, really
that's
cool.
brilliant. And links into actually, we were talking about kind of Scottish, kind of socialist and other
Mm.
um, drives historically. There's something really interesting in the history of textiles, even in the relatively modern era, around, the story of the orb in Harris, for example, for the tweed,
Yes,
which
yeah,
is not an unproblematic story
yeah.
in its own right, and totally fascinating things that we perhaps don't think about so much as we might.
And it just makes me think as well. I grew up in Dundee, right? My gran was a mill worker. Like the idea that Dundee used to be known as She Town and that all these women ran the city and they all worked in the mills and they were involved in that textiles. Like that to me is a really beautiful echo through time. Like I love that. I really like the idea of that. When we're in a time where things being made by hand are just not, we just don't have them now, really. Everything's all about, solely sort of online. I think that that's really interesting to see that that's being brought up and shored up a bit more in Scotland by quite a niche, seemingly quite a niche thing. It's just, that's really cool to us.
And another woman that hopefully will continue to memorialise, thinking about the jute spinners, as people like Mary Brooksbank, who did such
Yes.
amazing things and were very political and made
Oh
amazing
my God.
quilting
I mean,
song.
my hero of life up to this point, one of them is Mary Maloney, who was Irish but was in Scotland as a suffragette doing campaigns. And when Churchill ran as MP in Dundee, every time it made a move to speak, every time he opened his mouth, Mary Maloney rang a handbell. And I want to bring that back when Nigel Farage comes up to Scotland. I want to see women ringing bells every time that creature opens his maw. So I just think that there's more that we can do as women, and we've been told that we don't do that. It's not seemly. We're warriors. I know it sounds a bit naff, but we are. I think I want to see us getting more involved in public life.
Brilliant. On that subject, you've spoken with obviously your immense passion for the witch history, but women's history more generally, and women's lives and rights. What about your own time as a creative practitioner? Because the Witches of Scotland campaign must take a huge amount of your time, and you've said that you've still got a child at home who might be off soon. You might have that empty nest. Do you find time for your own creative practice that isn't witch adjacent?
It was a long time when I wasn't doing much because I was really in the trenches with the kids. But as we started doing it, took up obviously a lot of time to do the podcast and the campaigning and stuff like that. And writing a non-fiction book would not be my first choice. We were approached by the publisher who said, "Would you like to write a book?" And of course, no writer's ever going to turn down an offer of a contract to actually write a book. I mean, that'd be insane. But it took a long time for us to knuckle down to write it because non-fiction is not my thing. I like making things up. I don't really want somebody coming to me afterwards and going, "Well, is that true? Well, how do you know it's true?" Claire and I are kind of like, "Well, I don't know. It is true. We spoke to an expert." And they told us it, and that's their life's work. So that was quite tricky. It has all been fact checked. Don't worry. That makes it sound like we're very fast and loose. It is all true. But it was interesting because as we were writing it, Jake, our publisher, who's ace, Jake Lingwood from Octopus, he really believed in the project and kept us going when the two of us sort of couldn't be bothered or were overwhelmed with what it was that we were doing. Because, I was teaching full time, Claire was still a KC full time, still is now. I had the kids, there was various things that we were doing. But he was really encouraging. And one of the things that really helped me to really get my teeth into the project was he suggested writing these fiction bits of the book, so the fiction sections, where I've taken different people, some real people, so like John Knox, for example, some imagined people, like one of King James's lawyers, a minister's wife, the witch pricker, people like that, and then trying to see what was going on in their heads. Because everything I want people to do with this book is just to keep coming back to the principle that these were all people, just like you, just like me. And some of the people were accused, but it was a much bigger number of people that were accusers. So when we do events, often people will say to us, "Oh, I'm sure that I'm descended." And we kind of go, maybe you are. And in Scotland, it's very hard to prove it because the records just don't exist the way they do, say, in Salem in the States and in other places in America. You might have an idea about a surname and a location and that your family went back generations there. But I said, you maybe need to kind of reframe that a wee bit and think about it's probably statistically much more likely that you're descended from an accuser or somebody who was part of the machine of the accusations. Julian Goodare, who's Scotland, arguably Scotland's kind of preeminent witch trial historian, said to us that he estimated there were around about 100 people probably involved in that process, from the minister to the elders to the jailers to the executioner to the people that brought in the wood for the fire, all this kind of thing. So statistically, in a time where Scotland is probably about 900,000 people, and there were that many trials, it's likely, I think, probably that you were related to somebody that wasn't a savior or a victim. It was somebody who was probably quite involved in it. And I think it's really important for us to keep remembering that. And what fiction always does for us, it means that we can look out somebody else's eyes. We can travel in time. We can see what it's like to be a sharecropper in Georgia in the 1920s. We can see what it was like to be, in China in the 14th century. We can see what it was like to be in Victorian London. And all the time about doing that and reading and fiction is that I am able to pick up facts about what it's like, but I'm also able to think about, well, what must it have been like to live in those times? And for us to have put this book together, my focus with the fiction, until I think it's the last piece of fiction, is it's looking at people that were involved in the accusations. So there's only one that's from the perspective of a woman who was accused. The rest of it's people that were willingly or unwillingly involved. And I think that's really important because then you kind of go, right, what might I have done? and I think that that's a really wonderful thing about fiction. Interestingly, when the book got published in America, the American publisher didn't take the fiction because they said that American audiences would be confused by a combination of fiction and non-fiction. And at the time, I was kind of like, well, that's silly. And we've made it available to some readers in America in different ways. But sometimes you get reviews and there are people that can't understand our accent. So I don't know, maybe it was a good choice, I'm not sure. But because it remains in the audiobook. And I
Mm.
think that some American readers are confused by what's going on. So I don't know, maybe they did know their audience. But I think that the fiction overwhelmingly has been really helpful to kind of really put people in the place of the players of that time.
Can you tell us what's next, Zoe? Not for Witches of Scotland, but just for you.
Oh, I've gone back to a novel that I've been working on for quite a while. So I've got two completed manuscripts that I'm gonna tidy up because I was on pause with the kids and with COVID and then doing all this stuff. But I've really got back into it again recently. I'm writing a short story collection because at the beginning when I said to you about not knowing where to set things, once I opened up the door of setting things in a fictional version of the village in which I live and where I grew up, everything's basically written in this village now. It's like a much weirder version of the village, but that's where it's set. But I'm about halfway through a novel at the moment about a teenage girl whose father's dying in hospice and whose mother's hiding a pregnancy. And it's about how they kind of navigate the last weeks of the dad's life. So that's what I'm working on just now.
Sounds amazing, and good luck. And
Thank you.
look forward to those when they see the light of day.
Thank you.
Um, it's always frustrating to know that when you hear about projects that people are working on, that it'll be a while.
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, but I'm going to try and knuckle down. I promise. I'm going to get on with it.
Excellent. Here, here. It's always a good piece of advice for anybody listening who writes. Just knuckling down is always
Yes,
the
yeah.
hardest bit, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Zoe. It's been so kind of you to share so much knowledge and experience with us. This discussion has been hosted by the Saltire Society, a membership organisation founded in 1936 with the express purpose of championing the cultural life of Scotland. We've touched on a lot of the ways that it has been active in helping people understand their own cultural heritage and how to use that going forward. In its 9 decades, it has delivered a vast array of programme in a vast range of cultural contexts. We have local branches as well as the central organisation, as it were. And Zoe will be speaking to one of our branches very soon, and we'll have more information about that on our channels. The context of the society is very different. The context, excuse me, of Scottish culture is very different to the context in which the society was founded, when many of its early members thought that Scottish cultural inheritance would simply not survive the coming decades. But we still know there's a lot of challenge. We've touched on some of that today, and we hope you might be interested in joining us to stand with others who believe in Scottish culture. There's a link in the description of this video, which you can follow to find out more. And we'll also put links in the video for the Witches of Scotland podcast, for Zoe's books, and for lots of other ways that you can get involved and find out more about Zoe's work. Thank you for joining us, Zoe.
Really appreciate it, Mara. It was a lovely conversation.
Thank you. And thank you for listening. Goodbye.
Bye.